Okay, everyone. Hello. As you know, my name is Chris Adams, and you also know that you're at the Festival of Maintenance. I will barrel through this relatively quickly, but I have put that link online. So if you go to bit.ly fest maint reduce carbon, then if there's anything that you didn't see, then you'll be able to download and see the link to whatever thing I cited in the next few slides. Okay? Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Okay, hello, just a bit about me. I have a history of working at wacky environmental data startups. One company is called Loco2, as in locomotion, but also low CO2 and going local, man, for travel. Our job was to basically make booking trains as easy as booking planes, and that's pretty much how I get around Europe now. I also worked at a company called AMY, which, as you can see, stands for Avoid Mass Extinction Engine. We burned through $10 million of VC funding, hiring a bunch of scientists to basically take all these scary reports from the IPCC and DEFRA and everything, and put all the calculations behind an API. So you can say, what's the carbon footprint of making an X? And we can tell you why. And that's now been open source, so you can use it and build it in any kind of tools you'd like to yourself. I currently work at the Green Web Foundation, and make the web green is pretty much the, I guess, motto we're going with. And if you work in technology and you think about climate, I also organize a community called climateaction.tech. Bet you can guess what that's about, right? Yes. Okay, so this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk a bit about measuring carbon and how people do it, because the science basically says we need to do this. And if we want to do this, it's useful to know how to see if we're actually doing the right things. I'm going to give you a bit of a kind of idea about what the kind of emission hotspots might be in organizations, so that you'd actually see, especially in the kind of tech field. Then I'll talk a little bit about the kind of reduction strategies in the context of, well, this particular community. So first of all, if you want to actually track carbon that's emitted at any kind of level, at a kind of like national level or planetary level, I should probably tell you that technology as a kind of like sector is responsible for about 2% of global emissions, between 2 and 3. So that's basically aviation or shipping. So that's pretty big, all right? But if you work at an organizational level, you'd typically kind of measure things in terms of scopes like this. And the way that I use to explain this to people is if I'm basically through hot beverages, really. So let's say I want to have a cup of tea, all right? If I was to burn fossil fuels to heat a kettle and then use that to make coffee, then that would be my scope 1 emissions, all right? But if I was to use a kettle where someone else is burning coal on my behalf and I'm purchasing electricity, that's like scope 2. And then scope 3 is me walking into a coffee shop and then all these other people creating an elaborate supply chain so I can have coffee. So all my emissions are in my supply chain there. It's useful to think about that because this is a key thing which is kind of not so intuitive for us, is that all the emissions so I can have are at different places in this. All my emissions are in my supply chain. Okay, and I've told you what that looks like. This is what it looks like for actual companies. So Stripe, has anyone heard of Stripe here? Anyone? Okay, few show of hands. Okay, good. If you have paid for anything online, the chances are increasingly likely that you would have used them. And if you work in Stripe, at some point you probably want to put the heating on because it might get cold where you work. So that's your scope 1. You probably want to be able to kind of see what you're doing. So that's your electricity for scope 2. And scope 3 is going to be all of your services that you use. So for in this case, if you can read it, it says, yeah, servers, employee commuting, and business travel. So that's where most of it comes from. And now let's look at some bigger companies that you definitely will have heard of to get a better intuition of this. So Amazon released their carbon footprint this year for the first time. It's basically the same size as Finland, right? Which I was pretty surprised by. Now Amazon, they've got pretty big scope 1 because they have their own air force. There is Amazon Air, and planes burn a lot of fuel, so therefore they're going to have quite high scope 1. They also have lots of warehouses to kind of deliver things. Scope 2 is because Amazon have a lot of infrastructure which lots of people pay for. Is anyone a customer of Amazon Web Services here? Okay, half the room is using this, so that's what you see there. Also, they don't own everything yet, so they actually have to rely on other services too. So the scope 3 basically represents things like Amazon Alexas or things that they get built, and also say UPS and DHL or various other people who get things delivered to you. So this should start to kind of give you an idea for this. Now, Google is another company that you would have heard of with a slightly different emissions kind of profile. Now, Google doesn't do so much in the physical world, but they do use a lot of servers. And as you can see, this thing on the left-hand side, I just pretend I have a magic thing that is pointing to the left one here, right? You'll see these kind of big blue lines. That represents all the servers that Google is actually using. You can just about see this little yellow thing along the bottom, which is scope 1, as they kind of heat buildings too. I guess Googlers also like to be warm and comfortable. And what you'll see is you've got one thing on the left-hand side, but then you've got something on the right-hand side, which is smaller. And this is because if you want to use electricity, you don't really get to choose like artisanal, small batch, organically grown green electricity out of the pipe. What happens is you have to purchase it, say, from a company that will typically invest in more renewable power for you. So this is what the thing on the right-hand side shows, that their actual emissions, although they've used maybe 5 million tons worth of, say, electricity, because they're basically the biggest corporate purchaser of renewable energies in the world, the actual emissions work out to be about 1.2 million tons instead, which is the same as Liberia, as you can see. Now, Apple's another company you've heard of, and also a $1 trillion company. They have 0.6 million tons was their emissions last year. So that's the same as the Gambia. And what's interesting is that you can see where this comes from. So they're pretty green in this case here. All their data sensors, they use really, really green energy, as you can see. But if you look at the scope 3 thing, there's some interesting stuff here, all right? So basically 0.3 million tons, so 300,000 tons from business travel, which is typically going to be aviation. So half of its footprint is aviation. And then you see 0.2 million tons from commuting. And this is kind of an interesting thing because we're at the Festival of Maintenance. And this kind of means that there's a certain kind of employee who's able to work at a place like this, because as you get older, you might need to kind of help maintain your parents, then maybe remote work is something you might need to do. But companies like Apple, probably not so big on remote work. So you see kind of decisions that you make here will impact this. But that's not the whole story with a company like Apple, though, and this is why I'm going to talk about maintenance and kind of hardware now, all right? So Apple also has a huge footprint in its products that we purchase. So 25 million tons, so that's almost 50 times the size of what they have from here. And there's some interesting stuff here, and I'm not sure if it's going to be big enough for you folks to see, so I'm just going to zoom in on this part here. And when you look at this huge Scope 3 footprint, right, you'll see that almost 3/4 of it comes from manufacturing, making the actual iPhones that we might buy every 2 or 3 years. You'll also see that there is some from the product use, but not so much. And if we can contrast this with, say Google, who just basically run service 24/7, we tend not to use, like the devices we have, there isn't going to be that much energy being used in the actual, say, phones and things we have, because if they did, we'd get really annoyed because they'd run out of power very, really quickly, and then we wouldn't buy them, all right? And this kind of tells us some things and helps us think a bit about like what strategies you might actually have if you work in the digital realm and you want to reduce some of these emissions. So I'm going to talk about 2 strategies, but there are many other ones. The thing I found useful to help me think about this is this tool here. This is called a Materials, Energy, and Toxicity Matrix. We use this. I worked with a woman, Dr. Isabella Doñez. She's a PhD in industrial design, and she wrote a thesis about why designers fail to make sustainable stuff. And this is one thing she showed us. And it basically allows you to think through like the kind of phases of building things. So you might kind of get things out of the Earth's crust. You then might have to kind of use energy to kind of create something. And when you think about it, like if you think about silicon, the stuff we use, it's basically sand plus loads and loads and loads and loads of energy. So that's where lots of the emissions might be coming from. And then there's things like, say, packaging and distribution from here. So this is actually useful. And these kinds of things, you can't really see the questions, but the questions that you'd have in each thing help you decide how you might actually reduce the emissions in, say, building a service or building a product. But I'm going to talk about one strategy, for example. One thing is basically designing for longer life, just like the previous speaker mentioned. And the reason this works is that, well, you spread the energy over a longer period, like amortization, all right? And I'm going to point you to the Fairphone's life cycle analysis report, where they basically said, look, we're building a really kind of cool, fair trade, green smartphone, and we've done a report on where we think we're doing okay and where we could actually do better. Does anyone have a Fairphone here at all? Okay, great. Wow, that's the most I've ever seen. All right, so The thing is, this is kind of interesting, but there's a few ideas that I think Indy might have mentioned, or if there's any architects in the room, they might be familiar with. But there's also a few tensions going on when you're building electronics. So you can see that more than half of the emissions here come from this thing called the core module. And that's because over the last, say, few years, when we've actually been working with phones more and more and more of the computing and the brain ends up being integrated into one place. So that means that we end up having kind of less scope to kind of break things down, I suppose. And but you can actually see there's some things that you might want to have that you might replace. So things like, say, a camera module or, say, displays. The idea behind the Fairphone was you could basically increase the length, increase the kind of use of the phone by basically, so reduce the emissions over, say, per year by making it use it for longer. So the typical kind of baseline usage for a phone is about 3 years, and this is what you see on the left-hand side. So Fairphone did a scenario and said, look, we think that if we don't provide any way to kind of service or look after this, then people will typically hold on to it for 3 years. But there are decisions we can make to make it easier for people to kind of service themselves and repair themselves. And because there's so much energy going into that production phase, that's probably the single biggest lever we have to reduce the emissions associated with it. So that's why they have things like repairable, kind of replaceable camera elements and things like this. So this is how Fairphone basically make their phones green, when you cannot control that much about the fact that just making these is so energetically intensive. They basically tell you this stuff here, as you can read. And this kind of is an interesting pattern that you might actually see. But there's a problem with some of this, though, is that Fairphones are cool, and I bought one, but they're about, for the same kind of specs, you can get a phone for like half the price. And this makes it really, really, really hard. So when people speak to you, like, oh, I like your phone, would you get one? You're like, well, maybe if you want to spend twice as much. And that makes it quite difficult to actually see this kind of thing scaling in the same way that, well, or you can see it becoming mainstream without any kind of other help. And this, I guess this is one of the things, right? We do actually, we make some deliberate decisions about what we in terms of society, what we value here. And this basically makes things like, say, smartphones, it kind of pushes us in one direction over another. We don't really have the incentives to go with something like this. And I think that's a shame. And I think it's worth thinking about how we end up in these places, because lots of the tools and lots of the kind of components we use in electronics, they're not just like some lone hacker in a bedroom. In many cases, there's deliberate state policies to actually provide this, or there's deliberate decisions we've made. And another example, I mean, this is all the kind of publicly funded research that made iPhones possible, for example. And you'll notice that there's nothing to do with like circular economy or design for remanufacture or anything like that. And we have like legally binding targets in the UK to reduce emissions, but we also have a kind of moral imperative, and also we have an overwhelming weight of science now saying we need to reduce emissions in what we do. So I kind of feel that we're going to need to have some kind of help in this. And we've seen how basically we've seen how in the UK we've made decisions to incentivize certain things. So if you want to have like EV or like electric vehicle, there is now support for that. But we don't really have stuff like this for like maintenance right now, or even designing for more maintenance. So that's one option. The other thing you can do is, if you are going to accept that use of energy is unavoidable, you can at least make it cleaner, all right? And this is basically because, well, if you use more of green power, then the total amount of CO2 is going to be lower. And the nice thing is that people have started to realize that computers use electricity, and electricity comes from burning fossil fuels most of the time. And in the design community, or even online, you're seeing things like this. People starting to kind of provide ways to kind of calculate this or see this against your own site and see if you're kind of ahead of the game or you're not ahead of the game, all right? And also, you're seeing some stuff from interest from like governments themselves now. This is Emily Labram at an event that was organized last week, where she was presenting about the fact that, yes, inside GDS, they're trying to work out the emissions from what they have, because they have legally binding targets. But once again, there's a moral imperative. But one thing we found is that, one thing she was sharing was that it's really, really hard to find this, because we have such little data available, and the larger companies that you might purchase this stuff from, they're a bit reticent about sharing this because they see this as competitive information. So there's a kind of struggle and a tension here that we need to kind of resolve somehow. And I kind of feel that we may need to see more pressure from kind of public sector to actually make this possible, or even to kind of force to basically open this up for the rest of us to actually do something with. Anyway, moving on from this. This is actually an idea that you're seeing in other places as well now. So if you do anything with like digital design, then there's things like the Sustainable Web Manifesto out there now to talk about this. And even the W3C, the people who decide what the web is, they are saying this stuff as well now. They're saying, look, you need to do this. So if you care about this, you can basically say, yeah, the people who decide, who make the web have said, this is the direction of travel now. And the thing I want to share, though, so that's not going to be really enough, because you can design, you can redesign how all your websites work. But if you don't really think about where the power comes from, then you're going to have an issue. And this is an example of this. So this is a report from the Shift project. They were talking about where the kind of use of the internet really comes from. All right, and that little grey part, that's like us designing websites. But as you can see, that huge chunk is online video. To give you some perspective, right? So video on demand, that part there, which is basically Netflix and Prime, the carbon footprint of that is pretty much the country of Chile, right? And online video by itself is Spain. So like this is huge, right? And I'll avoid all the obvious jokes about pornography here. But you can basically see that. So that's one thing. And one of the reasons you see this is that is that we have different amounts of kind of carbon on different energy grids. So what you see here, let's say, look at France. France looks really, really green because it's full of nukes. Right, so really, really low carbon energy, but there's a few other issues about nuclear that some people might have. If you look at Germany, it's the land of solar and coal, so it's kind of midway. Poland, really, really, really into coal, so it's very, very kind of high carbon intensity here. So this means, depending on where you might be kind of running infrastructure, you're going to have an issue, or it's going to affect like the carbon embedded in any kind of services or things you need, or things you choose to use. But it doesn't need to be that way. This is a really, really cool thing that we found. So working at the Green Web Foundation, this company got in touch with us and said, hi, we're a kind of special case and we'd like you to certify us, all right? And what they did is they tell us, yeah, we work in Switzerland and we have a really, really green power. And normally we can check some of this by looking at, say, where they source their power. But these folks, what they did was they took a disused factory because they were in the Alps and there was a whole kind of community, a textile community over there. And it had like a water wheel coming through, so they had a source of power. And they basically just reused an existing building. And because the building was really, really large, they were able to make decisions about not needing to put loads of things to kind of keep servers cool. So they saved on a load of unnecessary maintenance and development there. And then they actually end up basically just reusing the power plant to provide all the power for all their servers. And we haven't had this before. Normally, when we ask someone, we'll ask for like a PDF or a certificate of to show that they're running on green power. They just sent us this photo, just so like. And it's quite hard to argue against a bright red hydropower generator like this when you're saying, no, we don't think you are green, or you are green. So that's what that came together. And as I mentioned, the reason I know about this is because I'm working with the Green Web Foundation. If you run a website and you're curious about either your website or your kind of digital supply chain, if they're using green power, then you can check here. And if not, you can maybe ask a question about, can we please take this climate emergency thing somewhat seriously? Because burning fossil fuels in 2019, really, really not a good look. Even the kids say so now. All right. The thing I'd say is I also organize this group called climateaction.tech. If any of this has interested you, and I hope it has, there's a little kind of brain trust of people like us trying to figure out how to do digital services, how to design things in a kind of more low carbon way, because, well, the science basically dictates this. And if there's one thing I want you to take a photo of, I'd really, really like you to take a photo of this slide here, share it with your friends, talk about it at work, because look, almost everyone here appears to be in their at least 25 upwards, right? Like, this is our job now. No one else is coming, and this is like the basic level of stuff we should be able to do if we're working with if we're building things digitally. And I'll just wait for a second while everyone takes a photo. Please share this. I'm really, really, I've done this a few times and it's really handy to actually have that. And we're actually now seeing people make policy decisions on other places because of this. And that's it. I'll say thank you. And yeah, this is how to find me, Mr. Chris Adams. The Green Web Foundation is a way too long URL, but we haven't got anything better. And yeah, thank you for listening to me talk so quickly. And if you want, I can take us right back to the beginning. Woo! For the link. So if there's anything I went past you quickly, you can see. So yeah, thank you everyone.